All right, welcome back. Even as Russia continues its strikes across Ukraine, a senior U.S. official is telling CNN the Kremlin is struggling to maintain its arsenal of high-tech weapons and missiles. The Deputy Secretary of the Treasury told CNN's Kevin Liptak in an exclusive interview that Russian fighters in Ukraine are running low on military supplies.
They have to make critical choices about what they can do in the battlefield because they don't have the tanks they need. They don't have the equipment they need to have helicopters. They don't have the semiconductors they need to launch precision missiles into Ukraine.
CNN's Kevin Liptak joining me now. So why hasn't Russia been able to supply its war machine?
Well, essentially, Frederica, they aren't able to get the parts they need for the munitions that they're burning through at quite a quick pace. And of course, we've heard a lot about how the U.S. is trying to arm Ukraine, but we are getting a new window into a parallel effort that the U.S. is taking to disarm Russia. And some of the figures that we've learned are quite eye-opening. According to a U.S. intelligence analysis, Russia has lost more than 6,000 pieces of equipment since the start of the war. They haven't been able to replace many of them. Even as early as May, they were running low on parts to repair diesel engines, helicopters, and aircraft they weren't able to fix because they couldn't get the components. Two factories were forced to go idle that were creating some of these microelectronics because they weren't able to get some of the foreign equipment. And in fact, Russia is so desperate for some of these parts to put into their weapons that they're dismantling things like dishwashers and microwaves. Of course, what is behind all of this are these really tough export restrictions that the U.S. and other nations put into place at the beginning of this war that have made it impossible for Russia to acquire some of the parts that it needs to make these weapons. And I did sit down with the Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo on Friday to talk through some of this effort. Listen to more of what he had to say.
Russia is running out of troops. They're running out of ammunition. They're running out of tanks and other materials. And what we're trying to do using sanctions and export controls is make it harder for them to reinforce their troops and to get the things they need to fight the war in Ukraine in order to put the Ukrainians in a better position to win on the battlefield and to make sure that Russia's invasion ends as quickly as possible. When you think about sanctions, there are two things we're trying to do. One is to reduce Russia's revenue so that they have to make a choice between propping up their economy and funding their war in Ukraine. And the second thing we're trying to do is going after Russia's military industrialized complex supply chain. China can't provide Russia with what China doesn't have. And China doesn't produce the most advanced semiconductors. Those are produced by our allies and partners. So while Russia is searching for these things, the reason they're using their intelligence services and front companies to try and get them is because the countries they would naturally turn to don't have them.
Now, because Russia can't obtain some of these high-tech weapons, they are turning to places like Iran and North Korea for less advanced weapons. U.S. officials say this is a cat-and-mouse game to try and tamp down where Russia can acquire new weaponry. Frederica?
Joining me right now, Ambassador William Taylor, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and the Vice President for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So good to see you, Ambassador. So, wow, what is your reaction to hear from our Kevin Liptak's reporting that Russia is so desperate it's actually dismantling dishwashers and microwaves for supplies?
Federica, this is what's been going on now for a couple of months, and it's very effective. So we've got Secretary Austin, Secretary of Defense, and we know the kind of work that he's doing in supplying the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And we have the Treasury Department, and we know the kind of work they're doing applying these sanctions. But what's really going on behind the scenes that Kevin had just described mm-hmm. is this export ban on components, on electronic components, and that's being run by the Secretary of Commerce. Secretary of Commerce is a key partner in this. She's doing a great job of shutting down the Russian economy and its dependence on these components, electronic components that the Russians can only get from outside the country.
And this is a consequence of the Western imposed sanctions, right?
The sanctions are there, and a component of those sanctions is this export ban, where we're not supplying the Russians with these kind of microchips that they require for precision-guided munitions. We've seen, Federico, over the last, week, where the Russians have just been blasting the Ukrainians, civilian targets, not military targets. They've just been blasting power plants and apartment buildings, just ludicrous. They were just war crimes. They were just cruel. And they've been using precision-guided munitions, and they're running out of them. Why are they running out? Because they can't resupply. Why can't they resupply? Because the Secretary of Commerce is cutting them off.
So Russia has been relying on some of its allies, China being one, Iran being another. Is that sustainable to help keep Russia in this position as it continues to, invade Ukraine?
No, you're exactly right. And the interesting question is on China. China has not provided weapons, and the Russians have asked them, and the Chinese have said no. The Chinese have not helped the Russians evade these sanctions that we were just talking about, or evade these export controls. The Chinese have not been helpful. The Iranians, it's interesting, the Russians are going to Iran and North Korea for weapons. They can't go to the international market. They can't even go to the Chinese that produce a lot of these things. So it's, and answer to your question, it's not sustainable. They don't have the ability to maintain the stocks and keep firing indiscriminately at the Ukrainians.
So that's all about weaponry. Then there's the manpower issue. Putin has had to conscript soldiers for his army. He's faced protests over the war at home, and even, some dissent from his circle of allies. And now reportedly, men are being abducted in Russia in order to be, put into the military, to fight in Ukraine. So is this a sign of a shifting strategy for Russia, or is it more of the same, just, trying to do what it has been doing without any kind of adaptations?
This is a sign of desperation. If the Russians have to go to prisoners, or if the Russians have to go to abductees, forcing people into the military, these soldiers are not going to fight. Right. These soldiers are not going to be effective on the battlefield. They don't have the equipment. So as you point out, the men, materiel, and morale, the Russians are hurting on men. We've talked about the materiel, and morale is sky high on the Ukrainian side and is in the dumps on the Russian side.
Wow. The Biden administration said this week it is giving another $725 million in military aid. At what point does the U.S. and its allies, kind of run out of the ability, the resources to continue to supply Ukraine, which is in the billions now?
And the answer is no time soon. What President Biden has said, what Secretary Austin has said, what the administration has said over and over is, we will be there for as long as it takes. The United States and its allies is an enormous economy compared to the Russian economy. There's no doubt that we can supply the Ukrainians with what they need. And it's coming strong. It's coming with heavy equipment. It's coming steadily. And that's going to continue. There's no sign that the administration is slacking off on its support for Ukraine. Indeed, the Ukrainians are now, as you know, as you've been reporting, on a counteroffensive that is pushing the Russians back towards where they came from.
Ambassador William Taylor, thank you so much. Always enjoy having you on.